Before we move on to the alternatives, which is the next section of this webinar, I just wanted to briefly talk you through the hybrid model for the development of the guidance that's set out in part 1 of the consultation paper. This model proposes the use of existing international frameworks with support from national frameworks. And in this model, IFRS for SMEs is proposed to be the foundational international framework. And this is because IFRS for SMEs is a single standalone set of guidance that is periodically rather than continuously updated, and so could provide a stable base for the guidance. It's also intended for many different sectors as well, and so it has a broader base. But as we know, IFRS for SMEs, with its focus on private sector transactions, doesn't address all NPO specific issues. So we're proposing that the full IFRS suite of standards and the full IPSAS suite of standards and their conceptual frameworks would also be used where IFRS for SMEs doesn't address an issue that's specific to non-profit organisations. We're also proposing that the model draws on jurisdictional level guidance to help develop this NPO specific reporting solutions that would also include disclosures. A number of countries have NPO specific guidance that have well thought through approaches to transactions that are specific to non-profit organisations. But depending on the country context, this can lead to differing solution, meaning that there is no single national based solution. It differs depending on which country you're in. So adopting this combined approach will mean that we can access the most appropriate elements of existing guidance without starting completely from scratch. And the alternatives that we're about to discuss kind of utilize this model to varying degrees, but are not a slave to it, because obviously at this point we're consulting. So I'm going to move us on to talk about NPOs that act on behalf of other entities and the alternatives for that. But before we do that, just to quickly go through the current international guidance focusing on agency arrangements that is in the accounting standards. This is probably going to be quite complex, and we're going to cover a lot of this when we have a webinar on reporting entity. But I think it was just important to acknowledge and summarize what's already there. So we have IFRS 10 on consolidated financial statements and IFRS 15 on revenue from contracts with customers. We also have section 23 of the IFRS for SME standard. We have IPSAS 9, revenue from exchange transactions, and IPSAS 23, revenue from non-exchange transactions, and IPSAS 35 on consolidated financial statements. So there's quite a bit of guidance that is relevant to this topic, but it mostly relates to the definitions of control and how to account for revenue in matters of agency and principal rather than expenses. So there's a bit of a read across happening here. Excuse me, my laptop is moving on its own, apologies. So the guidance on revenue is useful to understanding the implications for expenses, because where an NPO is acting as an intermediary on behalf of another entity, it might have both revenue and expense considerations. Generally, the guidance provided by the standards is based on the core principle that an entity is a principal if it controls the economic resource in the transactions. And current international guidance has one of two approaches in determining control. Guidance either follows a controls approach or a risks and rewards approach to indicate control. And so whilst the framework for assessing control differs, indicators of control are provided in the relevant standards to help determine whether an entity would be acting as principal in a relationship or as agent, and it focuses on the ability to control as being aligned with when it would be a principal. The indicators in the standards include consideration of which entity has primary responsibility for the provision of a good or service to a customer, things like inventory risk, credit exposure risk, and the ability to set prices for goods or services. And you can see that that's kind of very much kind of in the for-profit type of language. International standards, both within their conceptual frameworks and in specific standards, follow the principle that holding legal title to an asset is not sufficient to require its recognition in an entity's balance sheet. That not only applies to revenue, but to assets like property, plant, and equipment. And so what must be established is that the entity controls or has the right to control the economic benefits and the service potential inherent in an asset. In the IFRS suite of standards, IFRS 15 on revenue is based on a control concept with revenue only recognised if it is controlled. IFRS 15 does not provide guidance on non-exchange transactions like grants. So even if you were looking at the mirror, you wouldn't see the other side of that. The session on reporting entity will talk about control in IFRS in more detail, but the IFRS standards talk about things about power that needs to exist, exposure to rights or variable returns, and the ability to use power to affect the amount of returns that the investor gets. So to have power over another entity, an entity must have existing rights that give it a current ability to direct what it calls relevant activities. And the relevant activities are those activities that most significantly affect the nature or amount of benefits from involvement. There's quite a lot of complexity in that I'm not going to unpack today. So in the context of deciding whether transactions are being conducted as principal or agent, accounts preparers would need to look at the nature of its role in the transaction and whether it meets the definition of control that's consistent with these standards. The accounting treatment in IFRS for SMEs for agency relationships is included in the section 23 on revenue. And although this standard doesn't explicitly refer to a risks and rewards approach, the decisions on the supply of goods are effectively taken using this kind of approach. And the IFRS for SMEs standard specifies that in an agency relationship, the agent must recognise in revenue only the amount of its commission and not the revenue passing through. So revenue is only recognised where a non-profit organisation is acting as principal. Within the IPSAS suite of standards, both IPSAS 9 on exchange revenue and IPSAS 23 on non-exchange revenue establish that amounts collected as an agent of government do not give rise to an increase in assets or revenue of the agent. And that's because the agent can't control the assets that it's collected for its own benefit. So the collection of taxes by a tax authority does not increase the net assets of the part of government that's collecting it, because it's doing it on behalf of the whole of government. And these principles are capable of being applied to other non-exchange transactions, such as the distribution of grants. IPSAS 9 sets out that an entity is acting as an agent when it does not have exposure to significant risks and rewards associated with the sale of goods or provision of services. And it has similar approaches when it's looking at control over an entity that exist in IFRS, but it has slightly amended descriptions of control to reflect public sector context, but the principles are similar. The IFRS for SME standard and both IPSAS 9 and IPSAS 23 are in the process of being updated at the moment. And the principles in IFRS 15 and the concept of control that it uses are specifically included within the considerations for both of these work programs. In terms of national standards, we've seen again that those that have developed their own standards can variably follow IFRS, IFRS for SMEs, or IPSAS. I think in some of these jurisdictions there is additional guidance to help non-profit organisations. For example, in one jurisdiction, discretion in the distribution of monies to beneficiaries is a key factor in determining principal in agent. And in their guidance, if discretion exists, or if a non-profit organisation is a related entity, the non-profit organisation is a principal in the transaction. If it has no discretion, then it's treated as agent. And in other national standards, there can be requirements to recognise transactions in the financial statements based on whether the entity controls the transaction, so additional guidance. But there are differences to how control is assessed. So there is a variety of ways in which national standard setters have dealt with this. If we turn to the alternatives that we've set out in the consultation paper, the proposal is to include NPO-specific examples and guidance in all of the alternatives that we're setting out to try and aid transparency and disclosures. In many of these cases, we're proposing additional disclosures, but we recognise that additional disclosures can create additional reporting burdens, particularly for smaller NPOs. But practical guidance for preparers, we would hope would assist NPOs in making relevant judgments and reduce inconsistent treatments of transactions through different interpretations. So to turn to the alternatives, we have three. Alternative one is based on IFRS standards and uses the indicators of control used in IFRS 10. Non-profit organisations would determine whether they were acting as principal or agent based on whether they control the resources involved in irrelevant transactions. No transactions would be recognised in the financial statements where a non-profit organisation determines that it's acting as an agent in a relationship. Additional guidance on control, on how control is determined and how to measure the asset provided would be held would be provided, with specific examples to illustrate the kinds of arrangements that non-profit organisations have. Additional disclosures on material agency relationships with other entities would be required, including a description of the entities or individuals involved in the relationship, a reconciliation of opening and closing balances for material transactions as part of that too. Alternative two is based on IFRS for SMEs, where decisions on agent and principal are based on an exposure to risk and reward. As with alternative one, additional guidance and examples of non-profit entities would be provided, and again there would be a requirement for additional disclosures. So NPOs would determine whether they were acting as principal or agent based on whether they are exposed to significant risks or rewards in a transaction or relationship. As with IFRS, no transactions would be recorded where a non-profit organisation determines that it's acting as an agent in a relationship, and there would be additional guidance on control and how that's determined, and with specific examples to illustrate NPO arrangements. Again, disclosure of material agency relationships would be required, again, including a description of the entities or individuals involved in that relationships, and for material agency transaction, a reconciliation between opening and closing balances. The IFRS for SME standard is currently being reviewed, as I said, to consider the new IFRS standards. And a risks and reward approach that is currently within IFRS facilities will be reviewed as part of that. But I think it's useful to note that for many transactions, but not all, it would give a similar outcome to alternative 1. And finally, alternative 3 is based on Ipsos, and this also currently supports a risks and rewards approach. And similar to the other alternatives, there would be additional guidance and examples with a requirement for additional disclosure. Non-profit organisations would determine whether they're acting as principal or agent based on exposure to significant risks or rewards in a transaction. And just like the others, no transaction would be recorded where a non-profit organisation determines that it's acting as an agent in the relationship. And the proposals on additional guidance and the disclosures would be identical to in alternatives 1 and 2. As I've said, the existing standards are in the process of being updated, and current proposals are for a controls basis consistent with IFRS 15. So once those have been updated, there is a chance, probably a good chance, that the Ipsos will deliver a similar outcome to alternative 1. So given the current work programmes of IBSASB and the IFRS Foundation, it's entirely possible that the full IFRS standards, the IFRS for SME standard and Ipsos will all end up with the same approach to control within the lifetime of this project, but we can't be certain of that. And so in practice, it's possible that all approaches might end up harmonising on alternative 1. But the application guidance that is in each of those international frameworks could differ, particularly in terms of the illustrative examples, which may or may not be helpful for this project. Similar to the analysis of the issue paper on grant expenses, we've looked at some of the relative advantages and disadvantages of the 3 alternatives. Given that IFRS has most recently been updated from a technical perspective, it's likely to be enduring for a period of time. From a practical perspective, alternative 2, with its simplified risk and reward approach, may be easier to implement, as factors might be simpler to grasp. And similarly, for those reasons, alternative 3 may also be easier to implement. All 3 alternatives offer benefits around transparency through the proposed additional disclosures. In terms of disadvantages, both alternative 2 and alternative 3 do not align with the control framework in alternative 1, and as I've said, they are under review. The proposals exposed in relation to alternative 3 make change there very likely. From a practical perspective, it may be difficult to provide examples that work and illustrate relationships for all forms of NPOs. And under alternative 1, it may be demanding, particularly for smaller NPOs, to collate the information necessary to make judgments about the indicators of control. The disadvantage about examples for all types of NPOs that I just mentioned might also apply to alternative 2. And I think it's important also to raise that from a cost-benefit perspective, alternative 1 may also result in additional costs, and that might come from the assessments that are needed to implement that alternative, and though the cost of those assessments might outweigh the benefits of implementing that approach. So the list of consultation, so the list of questions in the consultation paper, the top 4 are consistent with the ones on grant expenses, and as I explained earlier, they're consistent across all of the issues that are set out in part 2. But we'd also like to hear on this particular issue about challenges that you might anticipate with additional disclosures, and also what additional disclosures might be most relevant. And so we're really keen to hear views about that we can factor into our thinking going forward. So now that I've taken you through these topics, I'm hoping, and we hope, that you feel ready to respond to them in the consultation. We are really grateful to kind of get the input that you've had today, and we hope that this has been helpful to you, because it has been really helpful to us to get your inputs, comments and questions. We're hoping that the discussion has helped clarify some of the proposals and your view on them. So the important next step we'd like to encourage is for you to go ahead and submit your own formal response, either as an individual or as an organisation. And as it says up on the screen there, a reminder that the closing date for these topics is the 24th of September. But you might find it easier to respond to the questions whilst today's webinar is fresh in your mind. You can build up your feedback as we go through webinars, or as you work through the various topic materials, or you can just respond to today's topic if that's your prime area of interest. All of the information is on the IFR4NPO.org website, including information about a couple more webinars that are coming up over the next few weeks. So in terms of responding to the consultation paper, we've tried to make it as easy as possible. And there are 3 different ways you can share your views. As I said, all that information is on the website. If your organisation already has a process for submitting comments on accounting standards, then you can submit a comment letter as you might usually do and upload it to our website. If you'd like to submit a response as an organisation, or collaborate with others, or just simply work offline, then the second option is to download a Word template that we've created and is available on the IFR4NPO website. You can download it, work on it over time, and then upload it to the website when you're done. The third option is great if you're submitting as an individual, and that's an online survey. You need to put in some personal information, but once you've done that and have saved it, you can come back to the survey as many times as you want before you're ready to submit it. So you don't have to do it all in one go. So we really hope that you feel motivated and confident to submit a response, even if you've not done something like this before. A large number of responses from all regions of the world will really help add quality and credibility to the guidance we produce. And we say this many times, we want to hear from those that have already got guidance through national standards and those that don't. We want to hear about what works well as what doesn't work well as part of this, because that will really help us as we move forward. So just before we get to close, I kind of like to sort of focus on some positives, because we've heard a lot about issues and challenges in the webinar today, but we're interested in terms of what your hope is for the future. The guidance offers the opportunity for a way forward, an opportunity to address the issues and challenges we've talked about. So we'd like you to take part in a Menti poll to share your thoughts on this. So if you've got a device, whether that be a phone, tablet, laptop, or whatever you have available, and can open a window in that and go to www.menti.com and access that. If you go into that, it will ask you for a code. The code is on the screen, 82760921. We'd be interested to kind of hear your thoughts on that. You don't have to leave this meeting to be able to do that. And we've put up in front of you a word cloud. That word cloud includes the words that came up in the webinar that we ran earlier today. But we'd really like to get your thoughts too. So we want to capture the positive, the hopes for the future that we can build on going forward. Accountability is the strongest word in the word cloud at the moment. That's just got larger, so that's really interesting. But also a lot of support for uniformity, clarity, and consistency. I see acceptability by grantors in there. I think that's a really important point, and great to have that out as a hope. I can assure you we're working very hard on that. If anyone else has got anything else they want to add, any additional words that want to go into the word cloud, we will keep this open for a while, so please do feel free, even if we've taken it off the screen, to add your words so that we can capture those hopes, which really help us. Yeah, so accountability, uniformity, out there. It's good to see accountability up there. Transparency, consistency, simplicity. Okay, so some important words there. Okay, if anyone else got any else, please do continue to share them. I'm just going to take that away and just reshare my screen just to close out our webinar today. And sorry, let's go back. So I just wanted to let you know kind of what happens next. If I can go back to that. So you might be wondering what happens, where are we in the process, what happens to your responses? As shown here, we're in the outreach section of the consultation paper at the moment. And starting in Q3, we will start to analyse the responses that come in from that. The forward, and it is those responses that are going to shape the draft guidance that we then develop. Our forward timetable is going to depend very much on the quantity and nature of responses that we get, but we will absolutely be developing the draft guidance in 2022, and we look forward to kind of continuing outreach and engagement with you and other interest groups so that we can continue to get input as we go forward. And finally, so how can you stay connected and engaged whilst we're doing all of that hard work, looking at your responses? We'd encourage you to subscribe to our quarterly newsletter if you haven't done so already. That will keep you up to date and also ensure that you're aware of any relevant events that are happening in your region. We'll put a link to that in the chat. We'd also encourage you to follow us on social media, specifically LinkedIn and Twitter if you're active there. If you can like, comment or share our posts, they get seen by even more people, and that creates the opportunity for even more voices to be heard. Non-profit organisations are incredibly diverse across the globe, and it's really hard to get to everybody because of that diversity, and you can really help with our mission to try and get to as many people as possible. You can always email the project or myself and Sam as well has been part of the event today, and those email addresses will be made available to you. We will be sending a follow-up email with this PowerPoint presentation and the recordings, and those will also be available on the website. So we'll put all that information together so that you've got them all in one place if you're not able to pick them up from the chat. Also, just a bit of a plug, if you have got colleagues in your organisations or in your networks who you think would be interested in similar events, please encourage them to check out the page on the website to see if there are things that they might be interested in. So I'd like to thank you again for your time, efforts, insights, the useful information that you've shared with us today. We really do appreciate it and look forward to engaging you as we continue on this journey to develop the world's first internationally applicable financial reporting guidance for non-profit organisations. I don't know if, Sam, you have a final word that you